Welcome to the New Silk Roads podcast. In this podcast, Professor Richard Griffiths attempts to answer whatever questions you might have had about the freight trains carrying containers packed with goods between China and Europe and its future role in the pattern of trade. And if you are interested in more content, take a look at our website, where you can find podcasts, books, and online libraries dedicated to the New Silk Road. You can also join our discussions in our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter.
What exactly is the China to Europe Express train?
Well, the China-Europe Express is a container freight train that travels from one city in China to another city in Europe. It's called a block train, and what makes it special are two things. First, it makes no deposits and collects no cargo at any point along the route. And second, the entire train travels through customs on a single customs document, and that saves considerable time when it comes to crossing international borders.
So the Chinese train travels all the way from China to Europe?
Oh, sorry, no, that's my fault, but I can see why you ask. When a new route's inaugurated, the train arrives covered with red bunting with Chinese characters celebrating the opening of the route. But the train has to change at least twice for gauge changes, and these are required because the tracks through Kazakhstan and Russia are on wider tracks than the standard tracks employed in China and Europe. And that change takes place on the border on parallel tracks, and the containers are lifted by a gantry train from one side to the other. And then again there'll be several changes in train and crews along the journey, and also again when moving into a new country, because you'll need someone who speaks the language, is familiar with the national rail system and regulations.
If the trains and the crews change, how come it's part of the China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Well, that's because the trains carry Chinese goods to Europe and European goods to China, and because the Chinese customs authorities have to arrange the start of the journey, and of course because the trains travel a long way in the first part of the journey through China itself. In addition, China has funded some of the border crossing points through Kazakhstan and Mongolia, but it's built none of the other infrastructure outside China. So once leaving China, the rest of the journey is on foreign tracks and in foreign trains, and often the overall logistics may be in the hands of non-Chinese businesses. Many of the early trains were set up as joint ventures between Russian and German firms, and many still are.
How big are these trains?
Well, in the European Union, the length limit on a single train is 750 metres. This is enough to carry 82 standard containers of 20 foot each, or 41 shipping containers. In Kazakhstan and Russia, however, trains of over 1 kilometre are not at all unusual.
How did it all start?
Well, the first China-Europe journey started in 2011 when Hewlett-Packard wanted to improve connections between its factories in Germany and those in Chongqing in China. In that case, all the containers on the train were from Hewlett-Packard. However, the groundwork for this all was laid by a UN body called CAREC, which stands for Central Asian Regional Economic Cooperation, and this promoted the idea of transport corridors and measured trains and truck border crossing times. And so, although 2011 was the first train involving Europe, South Korean car manufacturers had used block trains earlier to move car parts from South Korea to assembly plants in Almaty, Kazakhstan.
You said that the express train linked a city in China to a city in Europe, but which cities are joined together?
Well, it's not really the cities that are linked, but distribution centres that collect and dispatch cargo from the deposit by truck, train or canal boat to their final destination, often many kilometres away. But at the end of last year, there were 60 Chinese cities that were linked to 50 cities in Europe located in 15 different countries. But I have to make one other comment. These are negotiated agreements. Very few of these have what you would call a regular service, or even one or two a week. Some may only send a train on an irregular basis. And there, of course, are even fewer regular trains making the journey in the opposite direction from Europe to China.
Why is that?
Oh, that's partly because of the trade imbalance between China and Europe, but also partly because of the difficulties in exporting agricultural goods to China. And before you ask, this is only partly because of the import procedures in China, and partly because Russia is blocking the transit of such goods through its territory. This blockade's supposed to have been lifted, but there's little evidence of that actually having happened in practice.
Where did the trains from China come from?
Well, most of those trains come from Western China. This was an area targeted for increased industrialization at the start of this century in an effort to spread the welfare effects of China's spectacular economic growth. But lying in the west of China meant they were also very far from the coast and therefore access to the cheap shipping that could carry their goods to European markets. Now, three cities in particular were the focus of attention. Chongqing, which is where Hewlett-Packard set up at the beginning, Xi'an, the ancient capital of China, and Chengdu, which is famous for its pandas. These three cities, or more accurately the depots in these three cities, accounted last year for over half of the China-Europe express trains. So you can see that the other 57 cities that share the rest are all pretty minor in comparison.
So how did the trains actually travel to Europe?
Well, the trains from central China travel directly west, and they cross the Kazakh borders either at Alashenko or at a new border crossing point built in 2015 at Khorgos. At first, they went immediately north and joined the Trans-Siberian Railway there, but many nowadays travel further west and join the Russian railway system later. And that's because it's cheaper to use the Kazakh railways than the Russian railways, but some trains are still tied to the earlier routes by long-term contracts. Last year, these routes accounted for 80% of the 8,000 plus trains that made the journey. For cities located further north, there are other routes. Now, most of these trains cross into Mongolia at Ehrenhaut, where China again has been instrumental in improving the border crossing facilities on both sides of the border. The trains then travel through Mongolia before joining the Russian railway. And from basically a very small base, this route has grown very rapidly and accounted in 2019 for about 18% of the traffic. Now, at this point, I've got to make a comment about the figures. There is no systematic reporting of the data. The train may not be fully loaded, or it may be loaded with some empty containers. Moreover, the trains from nearby Russia carrying timber and wood may also have been counted as the Russian or as the European-China trade, and so inflating the importance of that route. Before I finish, I have to make one other point. There's a new route being developed that misses Russia altogether. Now, this involves crossing Kazakhstan and then ferrying the containers across the Caspian Sea before continuing by train from Baku through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and from there to Europe. The most recent train journey, experimental, in June 2020, took 15 days from the Kazakh border to reach Izmir in Turkey. Then you'd have to add 2 or 3 days for the trip through China itself. So this would match the time of the other routes, but the problem here is the potential bottlenecks that would occur in trying to cross the Caspian Sea.
Well, this all sounds very impressive. How fast has this service grown?
Well, the growth has actually been extremely fast. In 2019, there were 8,225 trains, and that was 30% higher than the year before. And 2018, in its turn, was 70% higher than the figure in 2017. Now, it's been like this from the start, but you have to remember we don't know how many of these trains were fully laden, or even how many of the containers were empty.
Well, to grow that fast, the service must be pretty attractive. Exactly how competitive is it?
Well, to be honest, it's still much cheaper to go by sea. Last time I looked, in July 2020, it cost about $1,800 to ship a 40-foot shipping container from Shanghai to Rotterdam. Now you have to compare that then to $5,000 to ship a 20-foot container by train. However, the sea journey can take a month or more to complete compared with a fortnight by train. So trains are therefore attractive for relatively high value-added goods and for just-in-time production schedules. But you haven't asked about the price, you've asked how competitive rail freight is. And part of the reason why the rail freight costs $5,000 is that Chinese cities have been subsidizing the trip to the cost of about $2,000, $2,500 per container. Now note it's the cities that are paying the subsidies, not the state. Chongqing, Chengdu and Xi'an are all in intense competition for each other for the available business, and they are the ones that are paying such generous subsidies, and so the other cities have to follow suit. Chinese government wants to phase out these subsidies altogether, and as a first measure they'll only allow subsidies to be paid if a train is fully laden, so there should be no empty slots or ghost containers in the future.
So, one last question. How important is the China-Europe express train service?
Well, let's look at the numbers. In 2019, the China-Europe freight trains carried 725,000 standard containers. Now compare this with the figure for Asia-Europe's long-distance seaborne container trade for 2018. Haven't got the latest data. And you're looking at 24.5 million standard container equivalents. So you can get a pretty good idea. Now it's okay, this seaborne trade includes Korea and Japan, but it's hard to suggest that rail represented much more than 5% of the volume being carried by sea. So basically, China-European freight is a niche market for high-value goods. Adding a couple of $1,000s to charge for a standard container that carries perhaps 15 tons of computer parts is not really going to alter the calculations in terms of price as to how you choose your mode of transport. The important thing is that times have to be quick, and more importantly, they have to be reliable. Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. The music was composed by Janet Zado, director of the Florence Youth Orchestra. The details of our presence on the social media you can find on the next slide. And I hope to see all of you here again soon. Goodbye.